Hello, Phil. Welcome to the show.
Hey, Miriam. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming. We are already geeking out on podcasting. So
No.
now it's time to geek out about facilitation.
Yes, put on the new nerd hat.
Yes. When did you start calling yourself a facilitator?
It's a good question. And I think it's probably when I went to a conference that was using that term, that was saying like it was going to teach facilitation skills. When I started in doing facilitation as I know it now, I was an outdoor educator. That was the title. In fact, my title was actually naturalist because I used to teach environmental education. So there was those parts, but I also did team development and leadership development as part of that job. It was like a jack of all trades doing outdoor education. And I went to a conference and they did I think it was called Advanced Facilitation Skills or something like that. And I was intrigued by the notion of what that meant. And then when I went there, I was reminded of, oh, that's what I was doing. I was sort of facilitating experiences, but I didn't know I was a facilitator. And sorry.
I was about to ask, what did you learn at this conference about advanced facilitation skills? What you haven't done before already, but maybe you didn't call it facilitation.
I think that if I remember, it was many years ago, but I think that they were really talking about the things that we know today of paying attention, listening, asking good questions, and really focusing on the reflection and guiding people through a learning rather than just being. Someone actually used this phrase recently, so I can't claim it, but I do like it, that rather than being a sage on the stage, facilitators are guides on the side. So that's really like, I think that where they were going with this, they were talking about framing of activities, they were talking about reflection, and they were talking about deep listening, which at the time I was like, oh, okay, those kind of make sense to me. But I think that there's a point as well when you're facilitating where the word facilitation, it seems like it's an easy thing and you can even describe it and say that these are easy things, but it takes experience and time for you to actually get good at them. Because there's a lot of like parts that feel difficult when you're in the moment, like actually listening and not talking, actually waiting and embracing silence, like those things that make you feel awkward, setting a problem or a problem solving activity to a group and actually letting them struggle. Like all of those things that I know now, but I think when I look back at my earlier facilitation, I was super awkward and nervous around doing that. And I would interject too quickly and save them. You want to save them from discomfort. And so I would never get to those points and not give time for conversation and cram in too many activities because I felt like I needed someone. Actually, this is something recent that I've still growing through this process of valuing how much my voice is in a space, but in relationship to the price that they paid for me. So like if I'm being brought in to facilitate something, then I used to feel like I need to be giving them stuff all the time. Like I need to be saying what they're doing wrong and giving them fixes rather than setting up a scenario, letting them work it through themselves and spending most of my time not speaking. And so I would value my voice at the level of effectiveness of the value of the money. I would feel guilty if I didn't speak. I would leave feeling I hadn't done a good job. Now I think I'm the opposite. So I'm getting there where I'm more comfortable. But I think that as a term of facilitation it feels more advanced.
Yeah, and I think it's exactly how you describe it. I relate a lot to that. It's this level of maturity to grow into and to embrace, to step back, not to feel responsible, to know that they have it within themselves and it's our superpower to bring it forth, to create the space that they feel comfortable enough to seek the answer within themselves and the group, instead of the teacher or educator would then just give them the answers. And yeah, maybe that's an interesting point. An educator or teachers maybe paid the equivalent for their voice and the knowledge that they're sharing, and the facilitators rather to be silent and hold the space.
And I think that's where education in a maybe more traditional format I struggle with, because I think that the way they've been taught, it's not the teacher's fault that they feel like they have to give this information all the time. When I work with school-based groups, if I'm having working with some kids and there's a teacher present, I have to spend some very specific direct time with that teacher, giving the preparation for what's going to come in the day, so that they don't do that jumping in and saving the group mindset, because there's a maternal and paternal instinct to save. And I think that sometimes as an educator, they're taught to give information, and they can't really stand sometimes seeing a group of students struggle through a process and feel like they want to interject. They'll constantly look at me and like give me those death stares of like, are you going to do something right now? Like they're arguing and seeing that as being a bad thing. And me being like, ooh, this gives me something to talk about. Like I'm not a fan when I'm working with participants, adults or kids or any age or whatever they're doing, and they're really succeeding at a task. For me, I'm like, I want them to have a moment of some conflict, not fisticuffs, but like some form of like this, challenge and disagreement that gives me something to then be able to digest and talk about and open up and allow them to be aware of, so that they could see improvement. Because if their improvement is, or their reflection is, we're awesome, that doesn't really give me much to talk about, other than, okay, I'm going to maybe change it and I might have to adapt an activity, or it gives me some clues, it gives me something, but I don't want them to always be purely successful. And sometimes I see people jump in, leaders of a group, even I've worked with faculty groups at school, and the principal has done this where they've jumped in. And I think there's a little bit of embarrassment on their end. They don't want to feel like their staff, their team have dysfunction. So they want to jump in and fix it. But in doing so, they don't present the opportunity for growth.
Exactly. And I think there's so many things to unpack. And from what you just said, I think one component is also the emotional component of learning. So if we struggle a bit, and then we have this kind of dopamine rush because we finally found the answer, this is what connects the learning to an emotion, and hence makes the learning sustainable, so I won't forget. If we are just presented with an answer, we tend to forget that all the time. But if we have struggled in order to get there, that's how the brain and the entire body remembers. And the second thought I had while you were speaking is actually a paradox. We taught, from what you explained, is the educator makes it easy for the students to access the knowledge. And on the opposite, the facilitator makes it complicated to get to the knowledge, but the facilitator is called facilitator, the person who makes it easy.
Yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely. I think that's true. I think sometimes there is, I myself have some personal issues with the term facilitator anyway, only because I struggle with the fact that not many people know what we do. And so I think that from a marketing perspective, or the elevator speech of your job, I don't think it really makes sense to people, because if someone said, what do you do? And I said, facilitator, they wouldn't know what that meant. So I think there's a barrier, but I think you're absolutely right as well, because a part of our job is to create a challenge. It's not to make the challenge easy. It's maybe to make the learning or the process by which you're learning easy. So we do create the reflective questions, the prompts. We don't let them struggle and then be like, okay, you struggled, moving on. Like we want to, goodbye, have fun. We do continue. What we do is we create a challenging experience that makes and then facilitate the ease of how do we gain the information from that experience and translate that into learning for the future.
Yes. And your specialization is in adventure education, so learning through adventure. So I would be very curious. So someone in the audience might be new to the term. So what is it? And what is the adventure part? Because what I hear now from what you just said in the context of our conversation is that the adventure part just add the cherry on the cake of this experiential learning and connecting it to emotions and the happy challenge.
Well, absolutely. So I want to first debunk, or at least get rid of some myths or some assumptions that might be made when you hear adventure learning or adventure education, because we run up against this quite often. It's not skydiving, kayaking, whitewater rafting. Those could be, they could be, but that's not all of it. And I think sometimes when you hear the word adventure, you may assume, and that's completely fine to assume that might be where we go with that. For us, adventure is outside of normal, a novel environment that has some quality of risk. Now, that may be physical, but more than likely, it's going to be emotional or social risk. And I include the social risk component because it's sometimes putting yourself into vulnerable positions in front of your peers. And that could be a social risk. You may not want to take a risk in front of peers that you would do outside on your own. So it's very team focused. In our specific industry and the work that I do, the component of adventure is a ropes course. So if you're familiar with seeing like ropes in the air hanging and then cables and you're wearing a harness and stuff, we call those challenge courses in my specific field. And the good piece in that, or the clarifying piece, is we call it a challenge course and not a success course. So there are places you can go where you can do aerial adventure parks, and that might be like a zip tour or something that you are really, they make the experience super accessible for you and very easy. And so you might sit into it, and there are some challenge, there's some growth there, of course, getting up in the air and those components. For us, we use the same kind of concept, but we make it much more of a challenge. So the aim isn't for you to get to the top of something. The aim isn't to get from A to B on a course. The aim really is to see how much you're willing to challenge yourself. And so we have the notion of challenge by choice. And it doesn't mean you choose to not participate, but it does mean you can choose your own level of challenge. And that might be you put a harness on and you're done. It might be you belay, which means being responsible for people on the ground. You might be put in a position where we do a lot of elements where someone's in the air and they have to get from A to B on an obstacle. And the only way to get there is if people on the ground pull ropes and manipulate platforms to make that possible. So there's some team components there as well. I would say that part of my job is about 50%. And we only see those things as additions to being in person, in an office, in a classroom, doing activities that other people in this might be familiar with, and having deep conversations. The challenge course is a tool, but it's a next step up tool. So as you described, it elevates adventurous experience, it elevates the novel, it elevates the challenge, and it elevates the emotional response. So what I'm able to get out of doing something in the classroom or in a office space where I'm doing some conversation, things that might be risky and new still too, is that I ramp that up. And if I feel the group is ready for that next level, I may take them to those experiences. And that's sometimes a challenge that I see in our industry. Some people see those climbing aspects and see those as the things that we have to get to or I want to get to because they're more adventurous in visual, right? Like, oh, it's so exciting. But for me, I look at a group and where they're at and figure out what might be ready for them. And I sometimes don't touch any of that stuff based on whether they're not there yet. And so it's all about using it as a tool in a tool bag. Like if I had a bag of props, I'm not going to use the thing that's riskier if then the group isn't ready. And if they're ready, then I can go up to that next elevated step. And so that's where the adventure portion really comes into the education.
Fascinating. So many questions coming up. And the first one that I would like to tackle is, or the association that I have is the one of comfort zone. And what I hear is for some, it can be very tempting. Oh, we're doing this adventure education and growing out of through the challenge of climbing up. So it's a process, yes. And for some, it might be a very easy challenge. At the same time, this same individual might not feel comfortable or safe to share something personal inner circle of colleagues. So how do you then adjust to a group where for some this adventurous, this kind of physical adventurous component is their comfort zone and can then become an excuse? Oh, I'm growing because I'm exposing myself to this novel way of team building, but then they would never dare to share anything personal in a circle.
That's where I think that what I really love about the work that I do is a perfect combination between all of those layers. And so if it was, there is an activity we call challenge zones, and it relates to the comfort zone. The way I can try to have people visualize it is like a bullseye drawing. And so in the center of that bullseye is comfort zone. The next barrier is challenge zone or a growth zone, and the next is the panic zone. That may be familiar to people. But we do an activity where we'll go through scenarios and ask you to place yourself where you would feel in that range. And so that can be a good opportunity just to talk about where people are at in terms of, I'll often ask the question of speaking in public, or conflict between colleagues, or you want to have those conversations. And then what I like about the stuff that we do on our challenge course is it's because it's not, the aim is to see how physical you are and how well you can climb. That's not the aim. It's also about the stuff that happens on the ground. So we create a lot of ground participation that involves different levels of responsibility. So if someone was very confident at climbing, then I will try to teach them the skill of responsibility on the ground that would require them to now belay for other people. So I take some of that piece away from me and give it to them. So now they're responsible for their peers. I've had some really incredible moments where a leader in a group, quote unquote leader, has been really vocal about wanting to climb really fast. But when I've given them responsibility for the safety of their staff, they don't show it. So that brings up a lot of good conversation. And so everything that we do then relates to reflective conversation and having dialogue. And what I also try to do, and the whole point of what we're doing, is to be able to tie in the experience that we had on the course into their real world. Now, if that's not there, then really the experience is novel and pointless, realistically.
Yeah.
If their goal is trust is an issue in their org, then I want to be able to create an experience where we're going to test that on the course and then have the reflection and the conversation on the ground because of that. And there is a reflective practice of the experiential learning cycle, maybe people are familiar with, but the idea is that you have an experience, you reflect on the experience, you have a conversation about what that action might look like in the future, and then you try it in the future. There's a cycle. I use a method of asking questions that I think really flows in that cycle really well, and I found it easy to teach people, and it's using what questions. So the first question is what, and it's what happened. So I just asked them to explain the experience. What did we just do? What did you do? What was your roles? Like rehash those kind of conversations, talk about it. And then the next is, so what? So what does this mean for this group right now? Does this bring up any contextual clues or issues that we need to draw back into our real world? Do you see things that happened today that might have existed in your office? And then the next is, now what? What from this piece that we've learned and this experience and how we've tied it to our real world, what do we learn about what we can take into our office to make sure this doesn't happen again? And what I like about creating, what I also like about the experience of being on a course is, as you described, there's this emotional tying in, the dopamine feelings that you have. The serotonin might also happen through the team experience. And they have this shared experience that then they can anchor them to a moment in time that can be used as a reflective process in the future. So we're working with a group of students currently who have some conflict issues, and we are able to talk about our experience on the course and say, you remember when we did that? And we were at extreme of an emotional response where you were at the peak of fear, and yet you had a moment where the group rallied around you. How did that feel for you? And then as an observer, why did you decide to step in and support them in that moment? And yet here and now in this thing where the risk isn't as great from a physical, but the person still has the same feelings, why are we not able to commit that same level of empathy? So we were able to tie in extreme experiences but anchor them to real experiences they have on a regular basis. And that's where I get really excited about it. We just create an elevated emotional response to a
Yeah.
reality that they have on an everyday.
Fascinating. And the term ground rules just got a totally new connotation in my mind. And what I would be curious about, is there a better because I can imagine that the two different experiences can positively impact each other, and I wonder whether there's a natural sequence. You can first create kind of trust through connecting on the ground in a circle, through talking, through communication, or even non-verbally, that will then help you to really trust the ground while you're in the air.
Mm-hmm.
If you haven't connected beforehand, there might be more fear. On the other hand, it can also, and maybe it's a personality thing, that if I have experienced this literal physical adventure in the woods, then I feel the connection and I trust them, and I can open up on the ground verbally, emotionally.
Yeah, I think sometimes there are moments where people will go through such extreme emotional responses to being at physical risk, or the perception of physical risk, that then they feel much more vulnerable and able to be vulnerable, because they can tie it to an experience that has justifiable vulnerability. So sometimes I think that speaking about our emotions in public to someone can feel like there is the risk analysis for you in your brain is like, well, it's hard to justify why I should do this or why I should feel this way. Whereas when you're scared in the air and you can say, well, I'm scared about falling, you can say that's the reason why you're able to be scared in front of a group. But once you've created the opportunity to be vulnerable and you've demonstrated it, it sort of opens up the door to be like, okay, they didn't attack me in the way that I thought they would when I was emotional. Maybe I can try it on the ground and see how it feels. Like, you've created an experience where you've practiced. And I think that's the other piece that I think is crucial to facilitation, is the opportunity to practice social elements of our being a human that we don't get to practice. I think it's so strange that we really get focus on our tactile skills of practice. Like, if I'm trying to ride a bike, it's okay. It's a known entity that I'm going to fall over. It's a known entity that I have to keep getting back up. But when it comes to having conversations that are probably like might be tough, or a deeper conversation about our emotions, we choose not to do it. We choose not to practice until we're much later on in our lives. And then we try it with this high level of fear that an outcome is going to happen that isn't actually going to happen sometimes. And then I think sometimes we were like, why did we not do this earlier? This isn't as scary as I thought it would be. But we don't practice. And that's what we get to have those experiences do in facilitating, is we actually facilitate social and emotional experiences that we actually practice. There isn't as much risk because it's tied to an event that you're doing or some experience you're doing, but that will actually pay off for you to practice in the future. And I think that for me gets me excited, because we're actually teaching skills that are far more useful in my perspective than trigonometry or something in math or whatever, you know.
Absolutely. And we can just create different contexts that are playful and still teach very serious skills.
Yes, and I think that's your use of that word is very poignant for me as well in terms of play. Partly I'm a big component. I've got a little thing behind me. Some people can see if they see, but but play is a huge part of the work that I do. If I had to explain truly what I do, people are struggling to understand, I say I play for a living and I help people learn because of it. It's not I create more playful experiences that there's so many benefits to play as a mindset anyway, but especially for adults, where the notion is that play is a childish pursuit. I like to reframe it and say, actually, it's childlike, not childish. And so we should try to do that more often. But sometimes when we have those moments where we're centered around some joy, some fun, and play doesn't always have to be like the most fun in the world. I've played a lot of things that have frustrated me. right? Like a board game that you lose at, right? Like there are pure examples of where I'm playing where something doesn't go well. And I think that those things are so important for us to learn from, though. And that's the other piece where it comes to the challenge, and where I say that the aim isn't always to get to the top. Struggle is real. Struggle is a thing that we should all at some point experience. And so my aim isn't always to have people always do well. And we talked about that with activities as well. Like, I'm not setting up a problem solving activity necessarily for you to succeed at that task. And it's not to be cruel. I'm not setting you up to be like, see, as a trick. There is a way to succeed, but I don't want it to be easy. I create boundaries and framing in some of the facilitation of the activities that make things harder, because someone will say, well, why can't I just do this? Well, if you do that, that would make it easy. And that's not what I'm trying to do.
Yeah. It reminds me of an interview I had with Colleen Panier. She's a video game designer and facilitator. And she brought up the example of playing golf. Well, you could pick up the ball and walk it to the hole, but that's not the point, right? The point is to have this super long stick and use this to place the ball. And I wonder, what is the perfect amount of challenge, or where would you see as an instructor, facilitator, educator, trainer, experienced designer to step in? Because I think I can imagine that in the audience, many are familiar with maybe finding the balance of emotional and mental challenge. But when the physical component comes in, where some participants might be scared of height, or scared of the woods in general, or other components. So how do you find the balance of, okay, this is enough challenge and this is too much? And what is the risk of allowing someone, giving someone permission not to do it, or to pushing them a little bit too far?
Yeah, I think that there's so much there. I think that that's a large part of, we talked about advanced facilitation skills. I think that from a perspective of adventure education, I think it's a Spider-Man reference, but with great power comes great responsibility. And we as adventure educators have, almost to a degree, a ramped up level of responsibility, because the outcomes that happen if we fail can be quite dramatically detrimental to the experience of the person working. And I would guarantee that when people heard ropes courses, listen to this podcast, they will either have one of three responses. One, they'll never have done it. Maybe it's intrigue. One, they've done it and loved it, or one, they hated it and they'll never do it again. And more than likely, if you've hated it and never done it again, it's not necessarily because of what the setup of the experience might be, but it's because it was very poorly facilitated. Because you were not, so you weren't given the opportunity to say no. You weren't given the opportunity for choosing your level of challenge. You were a part of a group who did this thing. Everyone put harnesses on, everyone put a helmet on, everyone climbed. And there was never the pretense or the awareness that you had choice in that moment. And I've been in this situation similar to those, where I've just followed the crowd. It's almost like getting in line for an amusement park ride. And then at the last minute, feeling you want to like leave, but there's social pressure and no one really said it was okay for you to say no, and you sit on it anyway. And then all you have in your head is, hell no, I'm never doing this again. And that for me is a really big problem for our industry as large. I think that people get put off when they hear adventure because they worry about the opt-in option. And so for me, what we tend to do is, there's no promise up front about what we're going to be doing. Like, I don't say when people sign up that we're going to be climbing. I don't mention that. Once again, it's a tool in a myriad amount of tools that I could utilize. And what is helpful for us on our facility is our course is separated from our main area. So in order to go there, you actually have to physically go there. It's not like you would do activities underneath all of the stuff in above you. And I think that that's a problem too for a lot of people. If you are doing your ground programming, but there's constant visual distraction of all the other things that they possibly could or couldn't do, they cannot focus because they're nervous or whatever. The other piece is, I spend a huge amount of time, probably in a day program, 3 hours or so. So like I say, an 8-hour program, that's a good amount of time just on connection-based activities and what I call reading the group. And so that is doing activities, creating experiences on the ground that might be challenging. They might try physical things. I might do a balance-based activity. And that might also give me some ideas. If I know that I'm maybe going to have some climbing, I put the harnesses on the participants early, but separate the climbing from the harnesses. Sometimes I think that there's this, you can imagine if you're a participant who's never done this before, as soon as the instructor starts pulling out hardware, it becomes real. So if I can separate the reality of the climbing from just the gear, so I'll have everyone wear them, because I'll say, we may in the future be doing something. I just want us to get used to putting them on and see how it feels like. There's no obligation to climb, but we're going to be doing activities wearing them. And what that allows me to also do is some activities that utilize some of the gear I may use, like a carabiner or rope, or some of the other things they may see. I'll do activities using them. All of this is designed to try to get that normality around that more expected. There's an expected normal. And so that they know that when they get out onto the course, there's not this like ramp up of skill. I have to now learn this. But the other key piece is, as I referenced, is this notion of challenge by choice. We're very, very clear on creating opportunities for opting out, but we'll have done activities on the ground that talk about advocating for your voice, empowering yourselves and making decisions prior to any of that stuff. So we've created the idea that that is a norm. We don't want to set it up that the first time they have to opt out of something would be when it comes to a thing that's more greater risk and can be more emotionally taxing. We do this, it's a very light paired activity, but it's handshakes or some high fives. It's a little goofy and silly in its nature, but it might be creating a paired handshake with a partner. So you're going to create a random handshake, or it might be that I tell you one and you do it. So there's a handshake called the wild turkey, where when people spread their thumbs and figs out wide, the other partner does a ball of the fist and thumb outstretched. And when they meet, they makes a turkey, and they may gobble like a turkey. So like a turkey. So we might do that, but then in a pair, they find a partner, perform that handshake, and then I give them a question prompt. So it might be, what's the most adventurous experience you've ever had? And how would you define it? But then I'll ask the group, okay, now let's get back into this group. Would any pair be willing to step into the center and perform their wild turkey handshake to the group? And most of the time, no one will volunteer, especially if it's the first one, because that's a very emotionally vulnerable place to be. So the next question I ask is, this is a great reality of our experiences of advocating and in feeling empowered. So what for you made you hesitate to volunteer? Whatever that reason is, it's valid because it happened. So what is it? And so we discuss it and we have a conversation and we talk about other components where they may have felt that way. Like, have you felt other moments where you felt embarrassed to step in front of your peers because X, Y, and Z, or I didn't want to look silly, or I didn't want to advocate for someone else because if I put my hand up, that means my partner has to go. Have you ever voluntold someone else to do something? So there's lots of those experiences. And then the next layer of question is, what would you need from the group to feel like you could take that risk? Like, what experience would facilitate the opportunity for you to be more risky in your everyday life? And so now we've created that just on the ground. So when we go up to the course and I'm putting people into harnesses and climbing, I'll say, you remember we talked about our ability to empower ourselves to make decisions. Everyone at this stage knows that they feel comfortable about where their own decision is and whether they're not going to climb or they're going to climb. But there's another layer to it as well. I always ask the question before they leave the ground is, what do you need from us? Because I think that sometimes people they'll say like, are you ready to climb? But they won't say, what do they need from us? So as an example, if you climb and you don't like everyone watching you, that's a very good thing for us to know before you climb. If you don't like us to cheer you on and you don't like to be the center of attention, that's a really awesome thing for us to know before you climb. Because if we don't know that, someone will go up, they'll get everyone going, whoa, you can do it. They then have the peer pressure, that social pressure to succeed. And if they wanted to come down, they're now probably not going to do it. They're probably going to push themselves further than they are comfortable, at which point they get close to panic, at which point they get close to saying they don't want to do it again. So there's so many layers to be able to create an environment for people to take risks that I think is such an essential that I think gets lost. And that's my job as full-time, is training people how to create environments like the ones I'm describing. And so I'm teaching educators how to create adventurous programming. But there's so many layers to that. It's not just build a course. It's not just take your kids rock climbing. It's about like all of the social components and the emotional components, which are constantly missed, which I think lets us down as an industry.
Thank you.
Yeah, so kind of rambled there and ranted, but
yes, thank you. And I find it beautiful how through the process that you just took us through, you also empower the individual to own their decision and to articulate it. Because I think part of all the other thing and the group thing, the personal decision, what do I want? How do I articulate it? And how do I take ownership of my decision? It's a very difficult one.
Very difficult. And I've got a perfect story, if you don't mind, if I can indulge you. But because I use this a lot when I'm training other people. So this happened to me. I was a younger facilitator using a ropes course. And a culminating element that people may be familiar with is a zip wire or a zip line. So the idea is you're at a platform of height and you get clipped to a pulley, and then you jump off or step off of the platform and you slide down on this pulley. And it's used a lot as this culminating hurrah kind of activity, but it has a great number of like levels of risk to it in terms of like sometimes a ramping up of height and all those components. Well, I was working with a high school swim team, all female swim team, state champions in Connecticut, which is a state in the US. And they would always do this culminating zip line. So that was the last thing they do with us on a multi-day program. Was all of the seniors, so all of the 18-year-old students would go up and they would perform this zip. They would stand on the top of the zip platform and they would read a statement of gratitude to their teammates before they zipped, which has a lot of like layers to it when you think of all the different pressure that you might experience. Now, there was every single person wanted to go except for one young woman, and she was very clear to me that she didn't want to do it. And she hadn't actually done anything at height for the full time. And that's fine. That's only one part of our work. So she didn't want to do it. And I heard it and I said, nope, I 100% understand you're not going to climb. Now, every other student did it. And I was at the platform at the time, so I was really high up. But I could see there was a conversation happening on the ground. And so I can hear all of the other teammates rallying this one girl to do it. Like, everyone's done it. You should do it. Now, I look down from maybe a younger, more naive facilitation mindset of, this is awesome what's happening, because the group is rallying around their peer and getting her to stretch herself. And I'm like, this is awesome. I don't have to say anything. It's not my role to like intervene. I will always advocate for what they're saying, but this is really cool that they're having this moment. So they start yelling up, she's going to come up. And I'm thinking, yes, this is great. What an incredible experience. So she climbs up, she gets to the platform, and she's actually fine. She doesn't have that kind of fear that I was worried about. I thought she might be stuck there for a while and I'd have to really talk to her. She did the experience. And the whole time I'm thinking, this is a home run. This is a great experience. I've done a wonderful job. I get down and I'm just high-fiving them all, and I bring them together, and I do an assessment tool for me to see their experiences. You use something called a thermometer. And it really means like a thumbs up is you had a really awesome time. A thumbs down is you had a terrible time. And anywhere in between is your own regulation of how you did. So I just said, just show of thumbs. How do we feel your experience was? How would you describe that experience? Now, everyone put their thumbs up except for that one last person, thumb right down. And I'm like, what did I do wrong? In my head, I thought that this was incredible. And so I asked the question. I'd love to hear, if you're comfortable sharing, why did you put your thumb down? And she said this that stuck with me, and I thought to myself, wow, what foresight as well of a young woman. But it's also talking about empowerment. So our motto at High Five, the organization I work for, is connect, empower, lead. So a big part of that is empowerment. And she said that she enjoyed the zip experience, but what she didn't like about the experience is that she had made a decision and she felt weak because she allowed her friends to change her mind. And she said, if that in this experience, I was able to change my mind, it scares me that in the future, when I go to college, if I am forced into a scenario where I really don't want to do it, that I could have my mind changed by my peers and I could do something that could be worse than doing the zip. And when I think of a young woman, I have a daughter of my own, like it got me emotional because I was realizing what I had done in that experience without knowing it at the time is I had allowed her to be disempowered by her peer group and didn't. I should have advocated for her initial thought in that moment and let her be strong in that. But when you have 12 people around you saying, you should do it, how do you say no?
And
So that's
how,
my
yeah.
responsibility as a facilitator to create an experience where she felt more comfortable saying no. And I had failed in that regard. But it was also a really incredible moment for me to see a young woman knowing that she had needed to be stronger in her voice and empowering herself. But it was such a good lesson for the rest of the girls too, very emotional. And it was a great end to that, which I hadn't anticipated. But when we talk about how do we prep people for making decisions, that for me was that real moment where it drew it back to the real of really talking about empowering yourself to be able to say no and how the vulnerability of doing that in front of your peers. And she had that experience. And that was very impactful for me.
Thank you for sharing this story. It is so important to keep that in mind, because it seems, as you said, even for more experienced facilitators, it might seem like a no-brainer. Oh, that's the team at work, and the power of the group to give her the courage. And then, who are we to judge that this is the right decision?
Yeah.
So the groupthink topic, just because 12 people believe that this is the right thing to do, who are we to judge?
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah, and how challenging it is when everyone feels a certain way and you are the outlying thought.
Yeah.
To feel like you could stand your ground in that thought.
Yeah.
But I also referenced that to when I'm teaching about the notion of the word just because I can do something doesn't mean others can.
Mm-hmm.
So this thought of, I see this a lot with especially in my field where we are going to have more physical experiences. Just because I can climb doesn't mean everyone can climb. Just because I like going on zips doesn't mean everyone else will like going on zips. So this idea that I have to put myself, my opinions aside and always lead with what is being told to me. What information can I gather from them, not from my experiences, to be able to guide my decision on where we go from here?
Yes.
I think that's so important.
Which leads me to another question of inclusion. So from what I hear, it's activities that require full physical functioning of a body. And I would just assume that there's no group with someone who's physically disabled or handicapped signing up for your activities. What's your perception? What could be maybe the pros of still doing it and how to deal with it, how to adjust it? Or is it, I'm sure that's something that you have processed or discussed in your organization already.
Yeah, and what's really great about that is that it's a once again another valid assumption. We have created several elements that are accessible. So we have the ability to be able to hoist people into the air, even in a wheelchair. So there is still the option to be able to get the experience of height, but you're not incorrect in saying there are certainly activities that are more physically demanding than others. And So that's always, I think, on that mindset of analyzing the group, having a really good needs assessment process where you're understanding what people are going into, what experiences we can provide, and what their needs might be. We do our best to try to meet those needs where they're at. If, though, they're still unable to climb, because there are people who are physically able, but not physically strong enough. There are, there's an ability piece, but there is also a physicality of they might be out of shape in terms of their ability to be able to do certain things. And there is huge vulnerability in that when it comes to being someone who is out of shape and still unable to do it, because they're going to choose not to. And that's where we have activities on the ground. We have you can sort of separate challenge courses into low elements and high elements. Now, there are ground initiatives and activities that you could do anywhere in a Zoom space, or you can do them, virtually, or in a classroom, or in a boardroom, or things like that. But then there are low elements, which are things that are slightly off the ground. So maybe cables a couple of feet off the ground, or obstacles that they're trying to go around. And then there's the high elements, things that you might need harnesses for. But once again, everything is determined by the level of where the group is at. So it may be that physically this group will never be able to be comfortable climbing. And so I won't ever bring those harnesses out, and I won't ever do those things. So it is about sometimes having that middle line. But if it's a one person in the group and the rest of the group is completely able, I will have that person still have an active role in participation. It just may not be the climbing component of it. And I think that that's a good lesson. Is everyone shouldn't necessarily need to do all things. And when it comes to delegation of tasks and strengths and weaknesses and all of those components, we get to have great conversation about, once again, the aim is never to get to the top of something, never to complete something, but to have a shared experience. And that's where I think as well, we're different in the work that I do than going to like a rock gym or something like that, where it's just one person going up and one person belaying, and the rest of the group just hangs out. Everything that we do has team components to it. So there's a method of belay. And when I say belay, that word means to essentially keep a rope tight for a climber. So when someone goes up, the rope needs to be tight so they don't come down. Now, traditionally, that might be one person using a belay device, a piece of gear that they have that they're passing rope through that holds friction. But there is a method of belaying called an Australian belay, which we utilize quite often when we're trying to involve more participants. And essentially, it's a ballast system, a counterweight system. So as one person goes up, everyone in the group is tied to the other end of the rope. And so as one person goes up, the group moves further back. So it still keeps the rope tight. So there are lots of different, and that's one example, but there are a lot of methods where people on the ground have an active participation in what's happening in the air. And we talk about some of those brain chemicals, one of those being serotonin. Serotonin I refer to often as the leadership chemical, but you get serotonin go up in your body and it makes you feel joy, a neurochemical in the brain, observing other people have moments of success. So that is, I think, sometimes the thing that's missed in the experience of an adventure program. If people can't do it, they assume that the experience will be devoid of an experience that's emotional. But watching your peers succeed at something is an incredibly joyful experience, especially if you had an active role in their going up and were responsible. When we teach people how to belay, most of the time their response is that was the key best part of their day. And we teach kids how to do it, and I think sometimes that's that seems higher risk. Not at all. I think kids are able to do anything that adults are really able to do when it comes to certain things. And in that one, give them responsibility, they step up to it more often. And seeing a student belay a student, or a colleague belay their supervisor, like those kind of moments, I think that that's not physically demanding of an experience, and is incredibly accessible. I will add, just as you talk about inclusivity, the industry that I work in is currently at a crossroads, or a tipping point where we really need to work better at diversity, equity, and inclusion in our field. We are predominantly white, we're predominantly male. And so access into our industry is a barrier. And physicality is a barrier. Until more accessible elements are created, it's a barrier. Until we create more environments for people to be able to come from different environments, different upbringings into our world, then we're really going to be able to, we're going to continue to struggle in making it a truly inclusive experience. As a minute experience, as an example, that only is replicable in my industry, helmets. So people have to wear helmets often to climb, and in our field you do too. They do not build helmets that are large enough for people that wear head dresses or religious head wear, or large hair like an afro or something. Helmets won't fit. So just from an inclusion piece, I want to put that out there, that our industry still has great work to do, great strides to make in terms of making it actually more accessible and inclusive.
And this would be a wonderful conversation to have amongst facilitators, right? Especially, so you do have the ability to push maybe the boundaries of the industry.
Yeah, and I think that's why I really love the work that I get to do. It's taking an adventurous component but bringing it into a facilitated environment. It's the melding of a really cool novel experience, but with the way that people learn, from my opinion, the best. So it's like a great combination of those worlds coming together. Whereas like there is plenty of education that isn't great. There's plenty of adventure experiences that aren't great. So we're trying to bring those together and make a learning environment that also is adventurous, that has benefit in both.
Good of the worst worlds.
Yes, exactly.
Nice. And I can totally see the extra educational piece when it comes to these weakest parts of a team, weakest in air quotes, because usually maybe they cannot or they don't want to participate, or because they're not in shape, as you said. And they can and do have a very crucial role in the team, although often it's not recognized. And this might be different in such an adventurous program as you're hosting it than in the office. So maybe suddenly the office assistant is the fastest in the physical experiences, and the highest paid person in the room isn't in shape enough to do that. And suddenly the world switches, but everyone is still relevant and contributing.
And I think when we talk about an adventurous experience being novel, it's awesome if it's novel for all, because then what it becomes is the great equalizer. In that no matter what your hierarchy is in your specific area, when you come to us, everyone is at that same level. And so we really get to see different strengths and come into the fore for people. And it highlights people in a slightly different way, which is really, really wonderful. When you start to, when a supervisor, a leader of a group gets to see someone in their team who is normally very shy and reserved come out of quote unquote their shell, but in a different environment, it can be very enlightening to them to realize like, wow, there was a lot of prejudgment there based on all of my assumptions, based on a very narrow window. When we think of our work life, it's a part of us, but it's not the whole of us. So being able to see other parts is really crucial.
Yeah. What would be, or what is the virtual version of adventure education? How adventurous can it be in my own living room on Zoom?
Yeah, great question. I think that for the most part, when we go back to the core of what an adventure experience truly is, it really just means being novel and having some level of risk. So we run virtual workshops where we teach adventure activities and we just translate them into a virtual setting. So as an example, one of the products that we have is one of these. It's called Ubuntu. It's a deck of cards that have images on them, and we use them as connection-based activities. And there are many different activities that you could use them in, but we can do them in a virtual setting as well. So being able to have conversations that are adventurous, being able to have risky experiences with our peers, having moments of play and joy, and then tying them into adventurous learning. It doesn't have to be, as I referenced, the tool for us is a challenge course, but it's only one potential tool for us. And it may be that you and others who are listening are having adventurous experiences. You just wouldn't deem them and term them as an adventurous experience in your perception of what adventure is, because you see it as being whitewater rafting, kayaking, skydiving, and those kind of things. But for us, it's really novel and new, and that has some form of a learning outcome that presents some level of risk. And that could be in a lot of different ways. For me, I often tell people my most recent adventurous experience is my daughter, because every day she does something new that's novel and scary and makes me feel nervous and makes her maybe feel nervous. And so that is an experience for me that would be quote unquote adventurous.
Yes. Yes. In this, following this definition, almost every workshop is adventurous because it's a new group. You have the dynamics. So every workshop is kind of new and a bit scary. And I would be curious, what is then the difference between adventurous and vulnerable? What is an adventurous experience and what is a vulnerable experience? Because being vulnerable is a risk, but it's a different risk than, at least that's what I hear. And I'm not a mother tongue, maybe it's just me.
No, I think that's a great question again. I think that there's not too much difference from my perspective. I think that if you take the moment of being going out to a challenge course, a ropes course, there's a perception of vulnerability there. I think it really comes down to a perception of what risk is. There's this notion called risk homeostasis, which I use a lot, and I like this. Homeostasis means staying level, right? Keeping things at a level. If you think of like a graph, bar graph, like trying to keep things level. And so risk homeostasis is that everyone has it, their own level of risk tolerance, and they're trying to keep your own level of risk at a homeostatic level. So you're trying to keep it this level, and everyone's might be slightly different. But as you increase different factors, it changes the level at which you're able to take a risk. So the example, a really good example that people might be familiar with, would be seatbelts in cars. When there wasn't seatbelts in cars, people drove at a level that wasn't as fast or hard because they were at risk of flying out of the windscreen if they like crashed. When seatbelts were introduced initially, the number of vehicle collisions went up. And the reason for that is because people felt, because I'm safer in this thing, I can drive faster. And so what they did is they think of the level of risk. They changed the safety components so their perception of risk actually went down, but the actual risk went up because they took greater chances. So when I think of risk in terms of a speaking and vulnerability in terms of Zoom, this might be actually a greater, riskier thing than actually being out on the course for me. So I always attribute an adventurous experience of having some level of risk. And that might be you being vulnerable in front of your peers, but it might not. You might be very comfortable doing those environments. But once again, for other people, it might not be. And sometimes new and having a moment of newness in your experience is being aware and speaking less and letting other people speak more because you notice they're scared. So there's always constant learning and experience through our adventures, but it might not be the greatest risk. And I often attribute as well, because I'm an introvert, believe it or not. My natural state is introvert. I say that I'm a personal introvert and a professional extrovert.
Yes,
because because that I put on the uniform of having to be extroverted because of my work, and I can't be like super reclusive in my work. But when I'm home, I love to be very quiet and read books and be left alone. And so sometimes these moments of being in a Zoom space and speaking, those are great risk for me. And so risk is everywhere around. But I think that sometimes the extroverted person who's very willing to talk, sometimes there's awareness of not talking as much. And that's sometimes their learning.
Thank you. Again, what came up for me is, again, the phrase words create worlds. And then I had this association, I think it was a TED talk that explained that whether you feel stressed or anxious or excited is actually the same thing. So your body reacts in the same way. It's just about the word you're putting on it, which makes you feel in a different way, which changes your attachment to the feelings. So, and they run these experiments telling people to just think that they were excited instead of anxious, and then they would perform like magic. And the other way around, if they were told, okay, to feel anxious, they still have the sweaty palms and the heartbeat going up and the trembling, same things. And I was just wondering if vulnerable and adventurous are actually the same things. What may become possible if we facilitate a disease, right? Let's stop calling everything vulnerable. Let's stop asking our participants to be vulnerable. Why not inviting them to be adventurous?
No, I absolutely
I
agree.
think to many groups, this would be an absolute game changer.
And think about just in terms of the perception on those two words. If you're described as an adventurous person, that's a positive trait.
Mhm.
If you're described as having to do something vulnerable, I think now it's improving that it's becoming much more of a strength. But for a lot of people, that still is not the case.
Yeah.
So maybe those people, if you were tasked with, okay, we're going to be going to this workshop and it's going to be a vulnerable experience, people would be like, nah, I don't want to go.
Yeah.
If people go and you're going to have an adventurous experience, more than likely you're going to go, sure, I'll give that a go. Because there's this weird mindset of what that might outcome be. But I would agree. I would say they're 100% the same things or very similar. It's just words. And it reminds me, actually, we do a workshop on emotions. So activities that focus on emotions, because emotion is such a crucial part of the work that we focus on. And in that, we talk about emotions, the notion of a good versus a bad emotion. But the reality is, it's the behaviors that might have positive and negative traits, but having the emotions are completely normal. And we should start normalizing our experience of having conversations about emotions, and we shouldn't feel bad about having them. The number of people that have an emotional or vulnerable experience, an emotional experience, and then apologize for it. Like if I started crying now, I might say, "Oh, I'm sorry, I'm crying." Why? Why do we do that? How do we get past that where we can start being, because really it's human skills. Really, a lot of the stuff we do is just teaching human skills. And I would love to get to a point where we don't have to worry about the perception of doing something vulnerable, the perception of what it feels like to do something adventurous, the perception of a good versus a bad emotion, and just be like, let's have a shared experience.
And I wonder to what extent it relates to something that you said in the very beginning of our conversation of feeling responsible for someone else's experience, or so the teacher stepping in because they feel responsible for the group or feel ashamed that the student doesn't know. And I wonder whether this apology for showing emotions is an apology for making the other person feel responsible for it, or putting them into a position that makes them feel uncomfortable. Or you are crying and now I feel responsible, or I have the impression that I need to do something about that. So unless we are comfortable with we're comfortable with our own emotions, and be trusting that the person in front of us is responsible and comfortable with their emotions, only then we can actually start accepting this and embracing emotions.
Yeah, and I think that ties back into what a facilitator is, and someone who's facilitating, who's more of an advanced or practiced facilitator, is able to shut off any feelings of like responsibility emotionally that maybe I have towards the group, and can actually be there and just listen to the experience that is happening without feeling they need to fix anything in that moment. So watching a group struggle and be okay with that, that's a hard thing for a facilitator to do.
For every
So I
human
think that
being.
that's where we're really talking about what it's like to facilitate. It's being able to really step aside from the experience of what's happening there and let them be okay with what's happening and just ask questions and be okay if it leads to conflict or leads to emotion. That's okay. I think sometimes we do a lot to try to protect ourselves, but protect other people's feelings. And in terms of doing that, though, we really stifle the ability for people to actually grow through an experience if we don't want them to have a hard one. I sometimes see people who don't plan enough when they're facilitating to actually have the reflective part of a program, where they're like really up against that line of like, oh, I'm going to be done in about 20 minutes. Well, let's just do one more thing. No, 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 because then they might create an experience where they never get to reflect on it, and so that can be problematic. But it's okay for there to be like, okay, I didn't leave you all in the greatest space right now, but I get to talk about the fact that that's a reality of what happens. And it's not this like, because I think that I think it's us ourselves having this wanting to feel like we're really loved as a facilitator. Like you look at if you do evaluation forms or anything like that, and if the group said it was a wonderful experience because everyone was laughing, then you equate that to being a successful experience. And if they didn't all laugh all the time, but they had a really deep conversation, you might see that as being a failure. Whereas it might actually be the reverse, because the first one is maybe all centered around how it made you feel. Whereas the second one was actually how they were feeling. And that might be okay, but that's a really challenging space to be in. It's for you to be able to leave a space and feel like it didn't make them feel joy. And is that okay? And I think that that might be okay. But I can also say at the same time, if I had that experience where everyone was like mad at me at the end, I don't know if I'd like that. So, yeah.
Yes, I had podcast guests who would say that for them, the highest recognition or the highest art of facilitation is that the group forgets about you and just sees their goals and totally forgets about the facilitator, that the facilitator had structured this experience or something. I think there's a lot to that. How can we overcome our own ego? And I wonder whether any evaluations of a workshop right after the workshop actually makes sense, because as you said, it's either emotions are high because you have this shared human experience. So there are a lot of endorphins or hormones going on anyway. And then what are you evaluating? Because I think the really good workshops, they show the results maybe a month after, when something happens or something clicks or someone thinks back. And I think some of the most impactful experiences I had, I hated them in the moment. God, I just wanted to run away, and I gave them a very bad evaluation. And these are the experiences that I'm still referring to up to today, and sometimes it's years later.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think the emotions and how you tie them to them you're planting trees that you never get to see grow. And so as a facilitator, and that can be a tough thing. So it's like, yeah, you'll never know what comes of it. And you hope you do a good job. And then my takeaway, again, going back to being a responsible adventure facilitator, is that you want to ensure that you're not going to have an indelibly negative experience that scars them, because that can also be the opposite, which is like, I've unfortunately, there are probably countless experiences where people have had a really bad experience. And because of that, they have now a perception of either the field or facilitation or team building, whatever it is, that scars them. And maybe they don't want to do something because of it. So those are problems. So you don't want to obviously dip the other way.
Yeah. Yeah. And still there's, I think that's an entire episode on the responsibility of the facilitator, because I believe that, well, once you go into the physical work, there's a different connotation of what this responsibility is, because you have safety components. But in terms of emotional safety, what is your responsibility of the experience? We don't know the traumata of our participants. And sometimes a simple question can have huge effects. And still we're doing our very best, and we can create scars.
Yep. Yep. Yeah. There's probably experience that I have not served the people I've worked with well. And yeah, that I have to, there's a point of like, all right, we've got to try to move on from that. But there's lessons there. And the lesson is we want to ensure that that does not happen again. Right. And how do we fix that? That's why I like, and I referenced it before, this comfort zone activity, because what that allows you to do is create an assessment tool where people get to mark themselves where they're at without making those judgments and assumptions that everyone must love this or everyone must love this. And so and what is nice about that as well is that other people get to see where other people are at the same time, who might work alongside each other more often. So I think that that's a really important thing too.
Yeah, and gets you to learn a lot about your colleagues that you may apply then back in the office or in the classroom or wherever, as you mentioned before. Wonderful. If someone in the audience now thinks, oh, I would like to be a little bit more adventurous in my facilitation, what would be your advice to them for the first step?
Yeah, I would advise, if you yourself want to be more adventurous, would be to try something new, and whatever that is, and it doesn't even have to be in the moment of facilitating, but to give you the feeling of what it might like to be adventurous for your participants, I think is a really crucial skill. A question I like to ask participants is, when was the last time you did something for the first time? Because for a lot of people, as you get to a certain age and you get older, those first times might be diminishing. And so putting yourself in vulnerable, adventurous experiences allows you to empathize with what it might be like for other people to do that. So as an example, I've just started recently learning how to ski. I live in Vermont and I've never skied. So I've been learning with my daughter, who's 6. And I'm going through all of the experiences of struggle and wanting to quit and having moments of joy and then being sad and all of that stuff for myself. So so it allows me to empathize with the people that I work with. And from a perspective of you facilitating that could be more adventurous, would be to yourself trying a new activity for the first time, something that was slightly outside of what you've done in the past. And it might be something that has an outcome that you were unaware of and you don't know where it will go. So it might be a problem solving activity, or asking a question, or having a deeper conversation, or asking something with some emotional weight, or showing your own emotional vulnerability by owning up to something in front of your group. I really admire facilitators who can say to their group that, or use moments of vulnerability to highlight something that they've had from their own lives and demonstrate that and role model that behavior. Because if the expectation is I'm going to have my participants be vulnerable or adventurous, I should, to an extent, be able to model that. And another thing a recommendation is, if you're not doing this already, is if you're leading activities or conversations or whatever it is, that you are an active participant, that you're not the person who sets an activity and sits off to the side and looks through your agenda or ruffles through your bag or whatever things you're trying to do. And those have valuable reasons at certain points, but that you're actually being a part of it. If you're doing get to know you activities, that's having conversations about knowing, even though you're never going to work with these people again, maybe involve yourself in the conversation, because as well, they're going to learn about you. And then throughout that process, then you're creating an experience where they're maybe more vulnerable because you're part of it. I really like to embed myself in the group that I'm working with. And that means getting there early, eating breakfast with them if they're going to do that, sitting with them at lunch. Like, these components of being more open and vulnerable with my participants allows me to be more adventurous with my participants. I can take greater risks if I am embedded in their culture.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Yeah, thanks.
And I will put the links to reach out to you and work with you and learn more about you and to sign up for your podcast in the show notes.
Yeah. And I highly encourage people to connect. I like talking about this stuff, as people may understand already. And I'm also very willing and able to help people if they even want to think of a new activity or new framing or anything. Happy to help.
Thank you. Dum, 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 dum. That's my podcast jingle.
Yeah. I